Welcome to Modern Learning on the Air. I'm your host, David Kelly, and today we're diving into a big shift that's reshaping how organizations think about talent, moving from jobs and titles and over to skills and capabilities. My guest today is Koreen Pagano, a longtime learning leader, strategist, and author of the upcoming book, Building the Skills-Based Organization. Koreen's work sits right at the intersection of talent strategy, technology, and human potential. And I'm excited to dig into her insights here today. Koreen, welcome.
Thank you, David. So happy to be here. Happy to talk about skills and skill data and future of work and all the things.
I'm excited to be chatting with you. You and I obviously know each other well, but for the listeners of our podcast who may not be familiar with your work, can you just take a minute to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about what you do.
I think most of my career I've been at the intersection of emerging tech and learning and how that's impacting human performance, which is I think a very relevant lens for skills as the industry has moved in that direction. But most of the last decade, I have been building products, and specifically learning technology products, and thinking about how to scale really what we would now call skill development or building skills, and thinking about what that looks like. 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Immersive Learning that was really, before we called things skills, was really about how to design for practice and what I would now call skill development. But over the last 10 years, I've really shifted from the design side into organizational strategy and data and how to enable organizations to make better decisions. So a lot of the foundational work that I did around skill development really evolved into, well, how can I help organizations do this more effectively? And skills and skill data have really been a big part of that data component that I've been working in for the last 10 years.
So the upcoming book is taking a deep dive into the skills-based topic, and I want to start right there with the title of your book. Let's start right from the top. What does it actually mean to be, as the book title implies, a skills-based organization?
Yeah, I think it's a really fair question. And there's lots of debate online about this concept of skills and how do you get started and what does it mean. And because I've been working with a lot of organizations around this idea of skills, defining a skills-based organization, I think, is actually a really foundational component of this. So for me, a skills-based organization is one that is committed to using data about the skills and capabilities of their workforce to make better informed decisions. And so when I think about skills, and there's lots of ways that people define skills and or talk about skills, but skills to me is a type of people data. And it's specific to what someone's able to do. And so if we have more data and more insights into what people are able to do with their skills, then we can make better organizational decisions on how to leverage people for the work to be done.
So everything that you're describing sounds like stuff that is not necessarily time sensitive, but there is an urgency to this discussion. It's definitely trending, and it seems to be something that there's a shift in terms of how we support talent in our organizations that has like I said, an urgency and a currency to it. And your book actually touches on this at the beginning. It's kind of why are we talking about skills? So what's driving the urgency around this discussion and what's powering the shift?
When skills when I first started working with skills and skill data, I would say the urgency was very different than it is right now. So I'm actually, maybe I'll address this from both lenses. When I started working in this area, the urgency was around really getting and making the connection between higher education and employers of how can we prepare the workforce for the work to be done. And one of the trends, and this now we're talking almost a decade ago, was new employees coming out of higher ed institutions or even certification programs in community colleges and different, like beyond K-12 education, weren't prepared for the workforce. And so the demand on L&D to take new graduates or people entering the workforce and close the delta from what they learned in their education to what they actually needed to do on the job was putting a real crunch on L&D at the time. And higher ed institutions had built competency-based education and competency models. And what was happening is that the competencies that the higher ed institutions were focused on were not necessarily the skills that employers wanted. And so there was a disconnect in talking about supply and demand, really, of workforce and skills. And so when I started looking into it, the urgency was, how do we make sure that folks are job ready? And that how do we make sure that they have the skills needed to do the work to be done in their first job and beyond. And then a couple of years ago, we all met LLMs. And I think what's shifted from that like job readiness and upskilling and reskilling and all of these things started to be talked about even maybe 5 years ago before LLMs are really on the scene. And now we are working in this AI, what I'm starting to call the age of metacognition, right? Like this idea that we're moving into a workforce where human capabilities are going to be paired with technology in ways that hasn't existed up to this point. And I I think organizations are like, we don't know what capabilities our folks have. We're trying to grapple with what they need. And they're seeing all these new capabilities come in through technology. And so mapping all of this and having a deeper insight and understanding is really important. And I would say the second piece of why it's urgent is that in order for AI technology to solve some of the business problems that people want to be able to solve now with AI, you need good data.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have good data to train a lot of the AI models to help us solve these problems. And so skill data is starting to become one of the catalysts for organizations who really want to embrace this kind of human technology connection. Skill data is a type of data that didn't really exist before. And with it, organizations can make smarter decisions and people can actually make smarter decisions, which is a whole nother lens of this, which is what does this mean for the individual? Because there's the organizational view, but then there's also the individual view of what this data can do.
So it's a very complex environment to be working in right now with all the changes that are going on. And one of the things I appreciate about the book is that it acknowledges that complexity.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges that I find, this is the environment that we're in right now, but really with any emerging technologies, I sometimes feel like people they get an understanding of a small slice of the overall pie, and that becomes their world, and they implement it within that space as compared to understanding the full pie.
Yep.
And I kind of feel like there's elements of that in this discussion as well. What are some of the things, as someone who's in this space, what are some of the myths that you think people are jumping onto, or the misconceptions that they're doing when they try to when they go too fast on this skills-based journey?
Yeah. One of the stories that is not captured in the book, but I talked to a lot of folks in a lot of organizations in preparing for the book to figure out the lessons that people have learned so far in trying to solve this data problem. And I won't say the organization and I won't name the person, but one of the conversations I had was with someone who had been hired by a very large organization to come in and solve this skills thing.
Mm-hmm.
And what he found shortly after starting was that every department in the organization had started along some path of solving for skills, but none of them were talking to each other. And I think what you just mentioned around like everybody having a particular lens of like how this can be solved. And one of the dangers is like suddenly you have an organization where no one's necessarily talking to each other about the overall picture and you start to focus on the trees instead of the forest. And at some point, because I do recommend that organizations start small but think holistically, and that's a big theme in the book, is like it doesn't, well, we'll talk about this, but I'm sure we will talk about this about getting started. But that challenge of you kind of have to prove the value of skills for your organization and understand what the real impact is. And if you don't have folks talking to each other and people are all just trying to go fast,
Mm-hmm.
at some point you're going to hit a wall that everyone's building a separate strategy. And now not only is the world not connected through a common understanding of skills? But even within your organization, you don't have a common understanding of skills. And so I definitely have seen that over and over. And I think that's definitely one of the challenges of like starting too quickly or not thinking holistically at the beginning.
Having some sort of a plan attached to this, like moving forward, giving it some sort of structure, getting everybody aligned, like you're talking about, can be a challenge in and of itself. And I, at this stage of my career, I find myself increasingly interested in the language that people use. And you describe the process in the book as a blueprint rather than a roadmap. What's the distinction there?
Yeah, and that's a big distinction because I'm a product person who kind of deals with roadmaps all day long, um, in terms of like what's the order of operations and how are we going to prioritize and carve a step forward. And as I reflected on what I've seen work for organizations, the stories that I've heard from lots of different folks in trying to solve these skills data problems. The reality is that I don't think there's one starting point, and I don't think that there is a single endpoint. That every organization has different business problems and urgencies and things that they need to solve for. A few years ago, it was, again, AI automating a lot of financial institutions in terms of financial advisory. And so there was a whole industry in the financial sector of people who used to give advice who were starting to be replaced by AI. But there was a gap in the financial industry in terms of data privacy and security. And so how do you think about that as a problem to solve within a business of like, we've got a whole bunch of people with skills that their jobs are starting to decline or go away or reduce significantly. And we've got a whole bunch of jobs that we need to fill. That was like this was 7-8 years ago, right? Like that was a very specific business need that demanded some real thinking into skills to see, is there an overlap or intersection between the folks whose jobs are declining and the jobs that are emerging in our business? Is there a way to transition those folks into those new jobs? Spoiler alert, there was. And lots of financial organizations like thought about that as a reskilling initiative. But that's just one example of like, that's an industry that had a specific need and a specific problem. And so they had a starting point to start from to say, okay, we need to solve for this business need. There are other organizations that are having issues with recruiting. There are organizations that are downsizing and don't actually know the impact of layoffs because they can't see the skills that are walking out of the door as they're letting people go. And I mean, we all see it in the news. There's organizations that are having massive layoffs all the time now. Do they actually have insight into the folks that are leaving? Do they actually know their skill sets? At this point, I would say they're flying pretty blind. And so it's those types of things that I think dictate where you start from. But I think there are, and why I use the metaphor of a blueprint, is I think there are very common areas that are the same from organization to organization, of types of problems to solve, of types of decisions that can be informed with skill data. And so thinking of it as a blueprint means you can kind of look at the whole picture and then say, this is where I'm going to start. There are some, if I really take the foundational like blueprint analogy to its to its fullest, there are some foundational things that are relevant in all of the places to start. There's a data component, there's a trust component, there's a business decision and metrics component, there's a how do you treat this as an ongoing business effort rather than a project. Some of those kind of core things are relevant no matter what. But other things, governance is relevant no matter what. But there are industries and companies that are going to care very much about the L&D use case versus others that care about talent acquisition, workforce planning, like list goes on, depending on what the urgency is from a business perspective.
You mentioned earlier that sometimes you have these pockets within an organization that are working on these and they're not even talking to one another. And another area where those silos can exist is just within the L&D and the HR function itself, that they tend to have their blinders on and just see their own work. But something like this shift to skills is bigger than L&D. It's bigger than HR. It's a cultural shift that exists within an organization. What needs to change within the mindset across the leadership and the employees of a company in order to support a shift like this?
Oh gosh, there's a few things. I think one major one is just how HR and L&D sees itself as and its role within the organization. I think, and I'm speaking in broad generalities here, I think there are definitely exceptions, but a lot of HR folks see their job as serving the employees and supporting the people within the business. There are other HR teams that see themselves as supporting the business and kind of operate as more of a legal function in their relationship with employees. I have seen very few HR organizations that have seen themselves as a strategic data source to the organization. And I would argue the same is true of L&D as well. Like if you draw the same parallels, and we know there's lots of different ways that folks have organized L&D within their organization. Sometimes it's distributed to lines of business, sometimes it's centralized. Just depends. Sometimes it's under HR, sometimes it's its own function. But I think the reality is, I don't think L&D nor HR have really thought of themselves as a critical data function as part of the business up until this point. And that really is, I think, the biggest shift within a skills-based organization is, yes, you still need to serve the employees. Yes, you still need to serve the business. But if you view your role in that as collecting, maintaining, analyzing data to help make different business decisions across the org, that's a very big shift, I think, culturally for the people functions. And it's, in my opinion, a welcome shift because I do think ultimately the HR and L&D functions within an organization have not been seen as strategic for a very long time. And even as we've tried to show impact of learning on business and show impact of hiring and recruitment and all the things, it's been harder because those data points and those metrics haven't been really viewed by line of business leaders as part of their key metrics. And usually the C-suite isn't viewing those metrics as part of their key success metrics. So skills really allows us to bridge the work that's happening in HR and L&D into real business impact metrics. And we have a data point now that we can bring into the discussion and decision making that can actually have a real business impact. I hate to say it that way because I feel like I do think HR and L&D do have real business impact, but I think we've struggled to articulate it.
Well, and let's dig into that a bit because let's dig into the L&D and the talent force, because I do think I agree with you. I think L&D and HR have had a significant impact on the workforce going forward, but there's been that wall of data, for lack of a better term, that we've been bumping against as long as I've been in this field, and I've been in this field for a number of hair colors. So but there's two sides to that wall, in my opinion. One is, and they kind of two sides of the same coin. One is the data that we have available to us. You know, we've never really had. I mean, you're never going to be able to tell this data story through course completions and the type of legacy data that we've dealt with. And connected to that, there's accountability to it, but there's also a connection to that. Is if we've never had that data to work with, we've never developed the competencies necessary to do this sort of stuff. So there is that two-sided coin of a wall that's in there. So what does L&D's role look like in that data equation now that these tools are available to us? What does it look like? And maybe part two, how do we get there?
Yeah. So I think L&D has the unique opportunity to be the keepers of the most recent relevant skills data for a workforce. by nature of the role that we have, if HR, and just following through an employee life cycle, if HR and talent helps introduce new talent into the business through hiring, then L&D has basically takes over from there. Of here's the skills you entered our organization with, and here's our opportunity to nurture, maintain, grow skills throughout your tenure in this organization and be the keeper of really the data set. And there's no other function in the business outside of maybe managers and performance management conversations and that insight in. There's no other function within the business that has the ability to have as much impact on skill development as L&D. So it does make sense that we could play that role within organizations to be able to offer insights, to be able to demonstrate impact on skills. It was going to require us to build, to your point, different skill sets, not only on the data analysis side, but in really understanding the work that's being done, which has been a struggle, I will say, for L&D to really understand the. I feel like I'm going to get myself in trouble here with all of the people I've worked with for the last, several decades. But there's this challenge of L&D, and we hear the complaint all the time that they're order takers or that people come to them with problems and that I'm just expected to fix it. And there has been a disconnect, I think, between line of business leaders within organizations that are trying to run divisions, and whether that's manufacturing or product or marketing or whatever the sales, whatever the areas are. Those folks tend to be the ones that are have more visibility into the work to be done and understanding what skills are needed and have that insight. And L&D has, because they have been a step removed from the work to be done, fallen into that role of order takers. They can't necessarily come up with a solution to build a skill if they don't understand the skills that are needed for a particular role. And so that communication piece between L&D and the rest of the business has been strained, I'll say. Maybe that it's been a, hey, they want your help to build a skill development something to help their team or employees perform at a higher level, and you don't actually understand what they need. And if that continues to exist, then I hate to say this, but line of business leaders will end up being the owners of the skill data, because they will be the ones that will be able to understand the work to be done and then articulate the skills that are needed. So if L&D is responsible for delivering the solutions and they're actually able to capture data, but they don't understand the work side of the equation, then they'll never be able to do the analysis. They'll never be able to talk the language of the business. And so the skill set required here, shifting to really having a deeper and closer relationship with work and the needs of the overall business, is changing. And I do think that's why some organizations have had distributed L&D departments, because they do try to embed L&D folks in different areas. We see sales enablement folks that are focused just on the sales team, or we see technical L&D leaders that are tied in with engineering, et cetera. And that's part of it. But then those folks have to be responsible for more than just understanding the work to be done. They also have to do the analysis side. So it's really that two-sided coin of understanding the needs of the business and understanding the work to be done that needs to get added into the L&D tool set.
I'm curious if you feel, and I'm just curious what your opinion is on this, because I do wonder if part of the gap that has existed in my observations over the years has been a technical gap, where the opportunity for L&D to tell a better story isn't necessarily in the ability to connect the dots of this person has these skills and they're applied in different ways. They don't know how to use the Power BI tools that were available to us to mine that data and get to that, assuming they even have access to the data. But we are going in a direction where a lot of the tools, feels like at least, are going to enable us to just ask the question, and the Power BI is happening behind the scenes and the answer comes back. So is that going to level the playing field a little bit to enable L&D professionals to be more strategic because they don't have to, they will have the automated admin, so to speak, to do the number crunching to answer the questions that they want to. Because I sometimes feel like they ask the question and they can't answer it because they don't have the technical expertise to get to the answer.
So I'm going to answer this maybe.
Okay.
And I'm answering this maybe because I think AI tools are in general only as smart as we are.
Mm-hmm.
And they're only, I mean, they're able to speed things, they're able to do things faster than we are in many cases and at scale in ways that we're not able to. So access to tool problem, yes, I think that's going to get solved with AI. And I think some of that component will get resolved as all the analytics tools get more user friendly and access becomes easier and all the things. So that's the yes part of my answer. The no part of my answer is if you don't know what questions to ask
Mm-hmm.
or what you're looking for or what's actually meaningful, then all the access in the world isn't going to help you with it. And so I think there's a shift that needs to happen, and I think we're already seeing it. That a lot of L&D has been focused on the development of content and courses.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of folks have spent a significant portion of their career thinking of the best way to teach things and the best way to present content and the best way to assess and right, like thinking about the deep learning stuff, which I'm a total geek about. I mean, that was my first book. I am into it and I get it, but it creates a bit of a tunnel vision when you are really focused on the content and delivery side, that you're losing the business impact piece. And so for folks that have spent most of their career thinking about the learning side and that experiential side, there's going to be a shift, because just like there was in the financial industry from financial analysts and to InfoSec folks, like L&D is going to have to become more strategic because a lot of the best practices in design, hopefully, will show up in the automation that AI is allowing us to do and speed up our ability to create good content and good experiences. And so what do we do with our time, if not then make those experiences more relevant to the rest of the business? So all of this is just a call to action for all of our L&D colleagues to say, if you haven't delved into the business impact data side of the L&D function, that's probably going to be the highest demand piece of our role moving forward.
So I'm reflecting on about the last 10 minutes of what we've discussed. And I have this visual metaphor of, instead of you and I in this virtual room, we're sitting at a conference, we're having this conversation, and I'm looking at the audience, and I'm seeing a good portion of the audience, their eyes are wide with just kind of like, they're overwhelmed. They're
Yeah.
just kind of, I've seen that look at conferences where they're just kind of like, oh my God, what did I just step into here? It can seem really overwhelming depending on where your starting point is. So what advice do you have for those people that are in the metaphorical room? What do you have advice for people who are just starting aligning their work in this direction? They're curious about it. They want to get started and we don't want to scare them away. Where can they start? Where can they just take that first step?
Yeah, I think if I was an L&D person and I was in this current, because I'm a product person, so but if I was in an L&D function in an organization today, I would be focusing a lot of my thinking and time on how do I ask more why questions and not as many how questions. I think that L&D has been really focused on how do we do this, not why are we doing this, or what is the impact that we're hoping to have, or what is the metrics that will show that this is successful. And I think starting to think about how you become a why person and be able to answer those questions of why rather than answering the questions of how is a fundamental kind of perspective shift, but is what is really the catalyst for anything that you might do moving forward. And I think that's to me, a little less scary because it just demands me to think about, okay, like if I have a pretty good handle on the how, or I've got tools to help me with the how, now I have to think about my customers within the business. And my customers are my internal audiences. And I have to really deeply understand my customers. And this is probably where my product bias really comes into play, because whenever you're building a new product, you need to deeply understand the customer problem. And then you have to propose a solution that'll be better than what they currently have to solve that problem today. And so, like, before going down a path of how do I do this, which is usually the design and development element, my role as a product person is to really understand the why up front, so then we can then decide on the how. And I think that's where a lot of energy is going to shift in L&D, is like, we've got this problem. And us saying, okay, why is this a problem? What are the barriers in the organization that are creating this problem? Do we need access to data? And what are the systems that we need to, if we don't have the data, how do we get it? And really focusing on solving those why questions.
I want to close our discussion. We've discussed a lot about data in this discussion, and rightfully so. And the book has a high emphasis on data, and rightfully so, which has kind of a parallel line with, I feel like every discussion that has an AI overtone to it right now.
Yeah.
We're talking about data, but taking that metaphor further, like yes, the data is important, but data doesn't solve the problem. Data itself, and it's not a silver bullet. How do we balance this shift towards data and the opportunities that exist within the data with the human element? Where do you see that piece of it fitting in?
So about a third of the book is dedicated to data, just because for skills, data is a really complex problem to solve. And the human component of this, with any piece of data, is, do you trust that data to help you make better decisions? Because if the people, us, don't trust the data to be accurate or what we need or specific enough or whatever the challenges are, then we won't use it for decision making, or it won't be valuable for us in solving the problems we're trying to solve. And this is a data problem, but it's really a culture organizational shift problem of how do we as functions start to be more data centric and actually understand the implications and meaning of that data. And so in my work, I mean, I work closely with psychometricians and data scientists in thinking about how to set up models and make inferences. And there's a lot of elements of skills initiatives that are focused on, can you infer skills? Like, what data do you need? How do you actually measure a skill? How do you validate a skill? There's a lot of like intricacies around the data component that all tie back to, do humans trust this data?
Yeah.
And so there's that element of it, which I think is if skills are ever going to be trusted, then humans have to understand and have insight into, where's the data coming from? How's it being used? Which gets into the whole black box of AI. Like if you don't understand the data that's in informing suggestions or recommendations and all of the things, then you may not trust those things. And we had this problem with people overly trusting AI at the beginning, and it was hallucinating. But if you didn't think it could hallucinate and you just took it at face value, it was wrong, or it was making things up, right? So having good data to help with this AI equation is a big piece. The second piece, which is a huge human element, and I know we're not going to have time to dig into it today, so maybe some future conversation, is that while a lot of this book is written from an organizational shift and transformation perspective, the real value for skill data for an individual is to be able to power their own career and understand what skills they have and what skills they need to be successful from a career perspective. So in that instance, it's really a human data problem that's bigger than an organizational decision. It's really, how do I drive my own development?
And that is its own conversation for sure.
Is.
We'll have to recircle back on that. Koreen, one of the things I love about you is how giving you are. You've given us here the time to explore this. You're also very giving on social media. I encourage everyone who might be listening to the podcast, watching the podcast, to follow you on LinkedIn, because you share a lot of your insights there as well. Where else can people find out more about the work that you're doing, connect with you, and take advantage of the resources that you share?
Yeah, so I have a fun career right now, transition where I'm doing a lot of fractional work, consulting and advising. We've got I have a new venture launching. So if you follow me on social media, you'll hear about that as it becomes available. That's tied into skills and organizational transformation and how executives can think about preparing their organization for these types of changes. But yeah, social media, LinkedIn is probably the best place to find me right now. And then stay tuned. There's some fun things coming. And book is coming out end of September. Yeah, September 30th.
Yes. And where will it be available when people want to check it out?
Any digital bookstore.
Yeah, there
Actually,
you go.
and if you don't like to shop the big box online stores, you can order it from your local bookstore, so you can get it anywhere.
Excellent. Well, and I highly recommend. I was fortunate enough to get an early copy of the book. I highly recommend it. So definitely check it out when it comes out. Koreen, thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, you've given us a lot to think about, not just for today, but as we go forward, not just about how we measure skills, but how we value them and how we can use them. I want to thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And for those of you who are listening, as I mentioned, I highly recommend bookmarking and pre-ordering Koreen's book, Building the Skills-Based Organization. I had the opportunity to get a pre-release copy. It's practical, it's honest, it's incredibly insightful, and I encourage you to check that out. So I want to thank you so much for joining us here for Modern Learning on the Air. We will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for tuning into Modern Learning on the Air. For all your training and services needs, visit us at insynctraining.com. And don't forget to sign up for our monthly webinars, where we cover key topics and trends in the learning and development space. Until next time, keep learning and keep growing.